First up, and he is a man on a very tight schedule today, is David Sykes from the BHA, the Director of Equine Health and Welfare. David, this is a fast-moving, fast-evolving story. Where are we right now at this point, 9 o'clock Sunday morning?
So 9 o'clock Sunday morning, I could happily report that we've not had any other positive tests except for the horses in the Don McCain stable. So presently all tests have returned negative up until when I was in contact with the laboratory last night at 9:30.
You are expecting, whilst we're doing this interview, a text from the Animal Health Trust just to give you the updated number. The Racing Post this morning, the number is 720. You can add to that now, can't you?
I'll be able to add to that. I could probably tell you that the Animal Health Trust in the last 3 days has done as many flu swabs as they would do in a year. So they've been working, you know, 8 till 9 at night. They're working Saturday and Sunday to process and all these samples that we're sending in there. They've done a great job.
So at the moment, can you confidently say that, that amount again have tested negative? So toward the 1,500 mark have now tested negative?
I would think that that figure yesterday would be similar to the day before, and we're looking somewhere in that 1,500 samples being processed.
So all negative, 1,500 samples?
All negative so far.
Which of course now begs the question, why are we still in lockdown, and were we right to be in lockdown in the first instance?
Okay. Why are we still in lockdown? We're still in lockdown until we can gather some more information. So again, you know, it's very nice to have 1,500 samples that are negative. Certainly a lot better if we've got some more of that. We've got a very good indication of what is out there in the general population. It also lets us track back to any of those horses that may have had exposure at Ayr or Ludlow or Wolverhampton meetings. And if we can demonstrate that those stables and those in contact horses are negative at that present time, we can gather quite a bit of information and then make some decisions going forward for that, whether at Sunday or Monday, about continuing racing or reopening racing.
Now, initially, when you cancelled racing on Thursday, there was widespread support for the speed and decisiveness of your action. Subsequent to that, there's been a groundswell of opinion building up, particularly amongst some powerful trainers with big strings, saying, and I quote, "This is a gross overreaction." What's your
Okay, so the thing, Nick, in any infectious disease process is, you know, the hard decision's the very first one, because if you think you're going to go soft and say, well, let's just see how this goes, you cannot gather back if you've made a mistake. So realistically, if you draw a line and say, this is the decision we need to make as an industry, let's make this hard decision now, let's be confident about then gathering information from that point forward, and we can then revisit that quite happily in a few days' time, which is what we're doing. Whereas if you make a decision, say, okay, it's fine, and then suddenly we realise we've had runners go to 15 other meetings, we have then started to track up, we've got positive cases here and here and here, very, very difficult to say how we're going to control that. So right at the moment I can say to you, we're controlling an infectious disease in one racing stable, and we haven't been able to demonstrate it anywhere else.
The veterinary community seems to be significantly divided on this. This is a citation from one senior vet in Newmarket, not, I should add, the vet who's been on Twitter recently. The BHA have totally exaggerated the seriousness of the current flu outbreak, forgetting that it is a non-notifiable endemic disease in the UK. Australia had a serious outbreak in 2007 as their horses had never been exposed to the virus. They were what we call a naive population, and therefore the disease affected their health greatly and was highly contagious. They had no option to shut down their racing. In Europe, EI is an endemic disease, which means it's always present in the horse population, just like it is in humans. So why is this a different scenario to horses in the normal course of things getting minor flu outbreaks? Okay,
so what we need to differentiate here is what is equine influenza and what is a respiratory disease in a racing stable. So, you know, a snotty nose, a horse with a cough could be, it's got a bacterial infection, it might have a rhinopneumonitis, it could have a herpes, it could have an upper airway allergy disease, okay? Scoped, dirty, treat it, that's fine. So they are infectious, but separating that from there is equine influenza is a very infectious disease. It's got a short incubation period, so we're talking about 24 to 48 hours. It moves very, very quickly. The industry goes to a lot of trouble to vaccinate and check the vaccination status of nearly all its racing horses. That's what we do. We try and eliminate other horses from coming in contact. We go to a lot of trouble to say we've got a racing population that realistically does not have equine influenza. You have to remember that there are no carriers in this disease. If you're clinically affected and you are now shedding virus, you're an infected horse. Once you've recovered, you're not. So in a racing stable, there shouldn't be this ongoing ticking of equine influenza occurring unless you are reintroducing horses into your stable from an outside source that are therefore infected at the time you're bringing them in. So, and normal training stables who have got good biosecurity would take those new introductions, keep them separated for 14 days, assess that they're not a danger to their stable, and bring them in. So, you know, I question the difference between a snotty nose or a dirty scope and a horse with equine influenza. I think they're two distinct things. The other thing to probably describe here is it looks that this virus we've got, which is from the American clade 1...
Yeah, Florida clade, isn't it?
Yeah, is quite virulent. It's nasty. Which means that we are seeing... I'll backtrack and say to you, we saw cases were reported in Belgium and France back in October, November last year in non-thoroughbred recreational horses, and we've seen those outbreaks sort of continue around, but in non-thoroughbreds. They were initially in non-vaccinated horses, and then suddenly we started to see it in some vaccinated horses, which tells us that it's being able to overcome the immunity of the vaccine. And that might occur because, you know, the vaccine might be 12 months ago, it's running out of immunity.
Yeah.
Or you've got a young group of horses, 2-year-olds, who've had initial vaccination scheduling, are due for their 3rd vaccination, and their titers are at the low level, can be exposed to this virus, therefore they clinically show symptoms, and they become shedders, and then they become shedders and challenge any other horse.
So on one hand, you're suggesting that this is a more virulent strain, therefore we need to be more vigilant. Yes? Yes.
Yes.
On the other hand, you're also saying that this is a very contagious strain. Is that right? Would it be fair to say that contagion is one of the main reasons why we're on lockdown?
Yeah, because it's spread by aerosol.
Yeah. Therefore, if that's the case, and there are 1,500 negatives of horses that have come into vague contact with the horses in Donald McCain's yard, surely it's not quite as contagious as you think it is.
Well, it hasn't been in those yards, and it demonstrates that it's not circulating in those.
But one of the positives was a horse that Donald McCain took to the races.
Yes, but at that time, Donald, and again, the thing of that is, incubation period is short. So I said 24 to 48 hours. That horse went to the races and showed no clinical symptoms and didn't show any clinical symptoms until the next day when it spiked a fever and was swabbed and is now positive. So what happens is we're saying, okay, here is a horse that went to the races. It is a positive. It may have been shedding on the day of the race, which is why we need to check those other horses that were in contact. And if we can demonstrate that it didn't spread at that point of time, then we're talking about one single isolated yard that we're looking at.
But if it didn't spread at that point of time and it's as contagious as you say it is, how come all these horses have come back negative?
Because they may not, I can't tell you at the moment, do I have, and the Animal Health Trust, because they've got so many swabs, we may not have yet covered all of the air runners.
Right.
Okay, so we may not have all those results back, and today that's part of the job that the team is doing, is to grasp and make sure that we've covered what we think are all those in contacts and prioritise some of those samples if they're not that, to make sure that we've got those air covered, because again, if they are negative, you can be much more confident moving forward that we have confined it to that one stage.
But at this stage, not every horse that has come into contact with a Donald McCain runner who's tested positive has been tested.
I don't know the answer to that because the laboratory, if you like, has got all those results and I need to get them back out. All I can tell you is everything that's being tested is negative at the present moment.
Rebecca Menzies had a suspicious case that has come back negatively, yet the diaspora, if you like, has reached far and wide because all the horses that were associated with the Menzies runners have also been tested, which brings in another raft of stables. Given the fact that her horse has now come back negative, why do you then need to test the Menzies-related yards, if you like?
Okay, so with Rebecca, the tests that came back yesterday were for 24 horses in her yard. 27 horses were tested yesterday, so they were following on because they didn't have enough swabs to do them all in one setting. So yesterday 27 swabs were taken. I haven't seen those results yet. That's one of my first jobs when I leave here, Nick, to see are those second 27 negative, because again, then if we have a yard that is tested negative, you can see that we can start to consider what would we do with those runners from Newcastle and from Wolverhampton that were potentially in contact with that, and we may think about redrawing our protocol to associate what we can do with those horses.
So you may actually halt testing on those yards if all of Menzies horses come
I wouldn't say we would halt testing, but certainly we'd sit down with the veterinary committee and be saying, rightio guys, this is what we've got. what is in the best interest of the industry?
Yeah.
Do we now say, well, do we go and make sure that we've tested all the in-contacts that might have been there from the Menzies horses instead of looking at the whole yard, or do we still proceed and look at the whole yard? So the other most important thing is all those in-contact trainers, right presently at the moment, our expectation is from their responsibility is to be doing morning and night temperature checks on those horses, visual checks that we don't have any respiratory, and if there is something going on, be ready to say, oh, let's swab this horse, we've got a problem. And at the moment, that's not coming to us, so, you know, you've got to be a little bit confident that things are moving in the right direction.
Okay, so you'd work on a more piece-by-piece diagnostic basis rather than a cover-all model. You mentioned the word protocol. This is an interesting point, David. Were you acting on protocol in the first instance? I.e., do you have something in your statute that says, in the case of equine influenza, this is a flowchart which we put in place, or essentially have you been having to make it up as you go along? Okay,
so Nick, I spent 9 years in Dubai, and quite a bit of that time I was involved in the quarantine centre, and with that, infectious diseases of horses coming in and out of the country from everywhere in the world. And so we have a pretty significant equine influenza protocol that sits for that particular in quarantine, and realistically I have said that it works out. It works very, very well. We can take that to here and be the basis of what we're doing here. But also remembering there are, you know, simply if you look at other countries that have got disease processes involved for containing equine influenza, the basis is really saying horse movement halt is probably the #1 thing you want to do because that's how it's spread. Putting in place, because, you know, it's an aerosol spread, but also putting in place saying to contact people that you could spread that disease if you've sneezed on, you're in a yard here and you go somewhere else. They're the sorts of things that your initial parties. Can I have halting of movement because that lets me not want to spread it from my index?
Yeah.
And can I put in place some biosecurity? Can I also put in place some increased surveillance? So in my yards I'm doing temperature checks. And then from that point on, you develop that protocol on, depending on what you're seeing.
Now, can we just get clear exactly how many horses in each yard are being tested? Am I right to believe that not every horse in every yard that you've placed on lockdown has been tested?
At the present moment, the recommendation is the in-contact horse is swabbed and done, and all horses within that stable is done at the same time. That was the initial cause, because what we wanted to do say is, if I have checked this horse and it is negative, if it has been, we could be, how can I describe it? If I am earlier than the incubation period or I am later than the incubation period. So this horse may have excreted for 1 or 2 days only. We swab it, it's negative. We go and look at 50 other horses that were in contact. We'd like to know that they are all negative at the same time.
Yeah, but not every horse in every yard has been tested, have they?
It should be at the present moment. The protocol is every horse in the yard, in those contact yards, is tested.
But if a trainer has 2 separate barns...
Okay, so now the story with, say, an example would be Richard Hannon, who's got 2 separate yards which are distinctly separate geographically, separate staff, no contact between, and his return runners are sitting in one of those yards. We have said that is fine, maintain your biosecurity between those 2 yards. This is the area that we're looking at, we potentially is the focus. We don't have to be running over here and testing these because realistically this is a stable that's separated that has not been in contact with our potential index case.
Let's talk time frame here. Can you give me an indication, if everything comes back negative today, when do you think we'll be racing again?
Not my decision to make. It's a decision to make with the veterinary committee. And again, I would, you know, it's not right for me to say. It would depend on what comes back today. If we came back all negative today, we'd be looking at maybe trying to decide how to move forward and start racing. But what we need to remember, though, Nicky, in here is the decision again still here. We need to be confident. We've been through some pain. We need to be confident we don't undo all the good by saying, oh, let's make the decision now, let's go racing, if we're not fully confident that we've got it covered.
But there's no way we're going to be racing by the middle of the week because, I mean, I spoke to one trainer this morning who's got north of 150 horses. He is on lockdown and his horses haven't all been tested yet. He's only had 3 horses tested and he can't get any swabs because all the swabs are taken up in Newmarket. So if his horses haven't been tested yet, say even they're tested today, the results from the Animal Health Trust who are going through this almost like forensic policemen like they have to, aren't going to be back until Tuesday, Wednesday at the very earliest. We can't be racing by the end of the week, can we?
No, it depends, and I won't say that. It depends on there may be some stables that get released if we were going to be racing, and we would have a situation where we might still have some stables that we'd say, you are still in lockdown, but these stables over here could race. And again, that would be a decision to do with the veterinary committee, protocol we have in place, and really it's a risk register. How risky is that decision to make to do that compared to making a decision over here? Okay, so we'd be looking at saying if we were going to do a partial release, it would be not an industry-wide, but maybe some separate training yards where we're confident they could go racing, but these guys still have to go through the process and be validated that they still are negative. And that may be painful because, you know, some trainers will be saying, well, why can't I race?
You're going to get some serious heat with that, aren't you?
Absolutely.
And you're prepared to take that?
Well, it's a decision that's in the right place for the industry. That's how I look at it. You know, my job is to say, I need to be with my committee making the right decision for the industry. If we think that's the right decision, then I'm going to have to take the pain. Yep, fine, that's the way it is.
And is that what you have to do as a regulator? You just have to front it out sometimes, even if elements of the veterinary community are not in agreement with you clinically or indeed sort of ethically, if you like?
Absolutely. I mean, my job is to do what we think is best for the industry, and that's what we're doing right at the moment.
And as far as your latest update is concerned, I know you were saying to me you were waiting on a text from the Animal Health Trust, and we were hoping to be able to get it out on the programme now.
And the answer to that question is...
Please say yes.
No, I do not have an answer. I'm sorry.
But what you can tell me is that we have moved forward from the 720 that was in the morning paper, and you're estimating roughly the same again, that about 1,500 swabs have come back countrywide negatively. And we've got to be clear that these are just phase 1 of the swabs. These are just the swabs associated with the McCain horses. We're not starting on the Menzies horses yet.
Oh, some of those may be the Menzies horses. It depends on what the veterinary surgeons from whichever yard sent in and who had available swabs. And now you've asked the question about running out of swabs. So what we did yesterday was I had BHA staff, our race day staff, go to the Animal Health Trust. They had a whole new supply of swabs available there. The BHA staff then took those swabs and have sent them out into the countryside so that, you know, this morning there are more swabs available so that we can, if you like, prioritise what we're doing as far as sampling is concerned. So I understand there's been logistic issues here, but, you know, it's unavoidable. Yeah. And as I said before, you know, 1 year of swabbing in 3 days being sampled through the Animal Health Trust has certainly been a stress.
So you've been very generous with your time. I know you're on a very, very tight schedule, and I've got to let you go. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions, which I need you to answer briefly. You sent out an equine influenza alert to all trainers on the 18th of January. On the 17th of January in Ireland, there was a thoroughbred who tested positive. Why are they still racing in Ireland if we're on lockdown?
Well, that's a decision for the Irish to do, and I don't know, is that thoroughbred in a registered premises over there or not? I've no idea.
But it is a vaccinated thoroughbred, because it's got Y there, vaccinated thoroughbred in Ireland, 17th of January 2000.
So I'm not sure. I spoke to Lynn Hillier this morning. We are in quite close contact, Lynn and I.
She's coming on in a bit.
Okay, to discuss what's been going on. So she has full input of what we're doing. You can see they've made some changes into their regulations and saying they need to have horses vaccinated every 8 weeks before they can run. And they're looking at, say, increasing their racecourse biosecurity by having radar, infrared to detect temperature changes in horses who may be coming onto racecourse. So that's their decision.
And secondly and finally, David, to what extent do you trust every trainer to swab every horse that you want them to swab and give them to the Animal Health Trust the way you want them to be done? Because it's self-regulation, essentially. You're not sending a BHA vet round to every yard. You're asking the trainers' vets to do it themselves. So what's to stop them putting one with a snotty nose in the yard out the back?
So, Nick, the whole point about that is responsibility of trainers to the industry, and I'd have to say that our expectation is that trainers do, in the best interest of the industry, go through the process, same as we're asking them to do temperature checks and isolations and, you know, personnel changes. We're requesting them to do that. We're not standing there as policemen saying we're checking and checking, but realistically, they are responsible to the industry as a whole. So what they do there, if they decided, oh, I'm not going to do this horse or this horse, and eventually we came back and had positives, which pulled the whole system down, that's their responsibility. I can't control that, but my expectation is for both trainers and veterinarians to be doing absolutely everything possible to minimise the spread of this disease.
working together. David, I appreciate your time. I know you have got to dash because you have got to get the latest data, and we've got a taxi waiting for you just outside. Anything come through?
No.
No. OK. But I think we've moved the story forward. I appreciate it. David Sykes from the BHA, he really has got to go. When you rejoin us after the break, Henrietta Knight, a Triple Gold Cup winning trainer, with her thoughts on this, and we will be joined by commentator and broadcaster Ian Bartlett. See you in a minute.